Hello and welcome to Bharat I'm Brigadier Chatterjee. We're going to be conducting another episode in our book review series. And this time the book that I have with me is the Indian Air Force Contemporary and Future Dynamics. The book has been authored by Air Marshal Dr. Diptendu Chaudhary. More about the author a little later. Firstly, let me say something about the book. The book actually is a way the author looks at the future for this particular force, the Indian Air Force. He starts pretty early in the day as far as the Indian Air Force's build-up is concerned, and then goes through the strategic changes that it has undergone over a period of time. Let me introduce the author now. Thank you so much, Air Marshal Chaudhary. Thank you for finding time for us. And I must say that Air Marshal has got about 5,000 hours of flying time behind him in fighter jets. He's also been the Commandant of the National Defence College. He's himself a scholar and a much sought after speaker at various forums. Welcome to Bharat Shakti, Air Marshal.
Thank you very much, sir. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Well, Air Marshal, I'm sure you always have a busy day. So my point is, how did you find the time for such a fat book to be put together?
It's very interesting. I think this book I've written it over. I didn't conceive it as a book. It was actually a collection of all my writings over the last 3-4 years. And then this offer came up to put some of my thoughts and writings together. So that's when we narrowed it down to the collection of these books. So actually, it was not something which I've written it in one sort of phrase. But very interestingly, I was also in the process of doing my PhD while in the service. And while doing PhD is the time I realized that there is so much more we need to know about our own service, and Air Force and Air Power especially. And that's when I started writing about it, and it was essentially towards my thesis. So all the sort of writings which happened thereafter sort of came out from there. And so when I put them all together for a book, it didn't take too long to put it together, as it would have taken a conventional book, because the material was already there, sir. So that is the thing. But the reason why I chose to put this book together, because over the years, if in my service, I realized that at least in the Air Force, there are very few people who write. And most of our veterans who write, a lot of it is anecdotal, experiential writing. There have been some writings on air power and on certain specifics, like 1971, when it finished 50 years, there was this whole resurgence. But I found at the end of the day that where we are today with air power is there is a distinct sort of knowledge space which needed filling when it comes to air power. And I thought not just the services, maybe the other services, the academia, the strategic community, possibly the policymakers and the media, could get another perspective from an insider view. That's how it stands.
No, I think nothing could be more true than what you said, that we do not produce so many authors. I guess perhaps because that's not our primary job. Because nobody experiences it more other than an editor who's looking for nice articles to be published in this
I can imagine.
There's always a dearth of it. Anyway, let's go on with your book. And I thought the way we could possibly handle this discussion is, rather than talk about the book only, we'll talk about a couple of issues, I think, which your book throws up. And what are your ideas on it? What have we expressed about them in your book as such? So the first one that I've got is, have we been utilizing the capability of the Air Force, or building the capability of the Air Force to make it a decisive factor in battle, have been issued till today? Or has it not been utilized to its full potential of being, let's say, a decisive factor in battle? What do you have to say?
I said, so there's a lot of history, and the reason in my initial chapters I deal with a little of history is because I think historically the role of air power in India has not been really studied too much. There are a few very, Air Marshal Bharat Kumar is a very active writer. He's written a lot, but that was the only source of information which came out. And in whatever little studies I have done, is that we find that the Air Force emerged from a mind space from a colonial handover from the British, and their utilization of air power from an Indian continental perspective as a part of the World War II, in fact, when it really mattered, is that they needed a tactical air force for this region. The strategic element was remained with them. So when the Air Force handover took place, or the independence took place, and the Air Force, our country became independent, and suddenly we were now an Indian Air Force, we were already rooted in a tactical legacy. And then our just pre-independence performance of the Indian Air Force in the Burma campaign was immense. And it was essentially towards supporting the Allied forces. The thrust into first to hold off Japan, and then later travel further westward, push the Japanese back. And somehow historically that became the benchmark of origins of thinking of employment of air power. So it remained pretty much in support of the other services. But that was a initial limitation. Moment independence happened, so at some point air defense came along with it, and Air Force was was the sole keeper of air defense, India's air defense. So it brought in a whole new aspect into the area. But as Air Marshal Jasjit, I think, sorry, I beg your pardon, Air Commodore Jasjit wrote very presciently, is that a lot of Air Force, what it is today, is an outcome of something like, I would say, an internal challenge of dealing with our past, of a support legacy, of a tactical Air Force legacy, and growing roles which were not envisaged probably in the colonial eras. Now, having become an independent, all-comprehensive force, we find that there's a huge gap of what the Air Force is actually capable of, and it does, vis-a-vis when you see the role restricted from purely a support function. Now I'll circle back to this a little bit, because I think here there is where the possibly the different perceptions of air power of the Air Force and other services lie in the fact that the other services look at air power as what air power can do for them,
exactly,
for their service requirements, and which is justifiable, which is absolutely right. But that is not the sole responsibility of air power. That is a major point I think I was trying to make in this book. And what happens if you see historically over the period of time, 47 air power was restrained because the British masters, the chiefs, it had just become a commonwealth to nations. They didn't want, it would look very bad on their CV that their newly produced two nations have gone to war with each other. So they felt that if they bring in the Air Force, it will escalate.
Okay.
That wasn't used then as much. They wanted to restrain air power. Same thing happened in 62. The fear of escalation prevented us using air power offensively.
Exactly.
Which is a big mistake, I think, now we think back. Because frankly, there was not enough of PLAF to be of consequence in the 62 war in the region. Air Force could have made a huge difference, offensive employment of air power. 65 is the first time after 62 when it was the first war we fought with credit, but essentially we still fought army to army, Air Force to Air Force. I think 71 is the first time air power got freed of all shackles. Even in 65 it was restrained. 40% of Indian Air Force's assets were tied up on the Eastern Front on the possibility of a Chinese intervention. Okay. So effectively only 60% of IAF's bench strength fought against Pakistan, an air force which had been supported by the US aid program militarily for a long time. So our numbers were also old. The platforms that we had were vintage, dated. We had vampires and things like that flying in 71. But the point is, what I'm trying to get at is in 65, each service sort of redeemed itself as a service to the nation's eye. But 71 was the only time we came together for a common goal of national security. And national interest.
National interest.
So we fought the war, but the sad part, I personally feel, is that from an academic perspective, there's a lot of research on the Bangladesh side, very little on the Western Front.
Well, it's a common problem encountered in all the three services, I would say.
And why I say this again, sir, because anything tomorrow which we're going to face will not have the same dynamics as the 71 war. It will be a hugely contested battle. So I think there are more lessons to learn from the Western Front of on the Western Front of the army and the Air Force especially, to draw lessons for the future. So I think at the end of the day, I'll just simply put that there's a vast difference what air power can do today in the future. And that thought needs to change to enable all the services to come together to serve a larger national goal.
Well, let's take off from there itself.
So,
You have this Ukraine war going and you have this war in Gaza going. The war in Gaza may be its own type, but Ukraine war perhaps, at least it is not as one-sided as things have been earlier, Iraqi freedom,
Yes.
etc., or things like that. Not exactly that you have total mastery of the airspace altogether. So have we picked up any lessons from these two wars? And if so, what are these?
I think there's a lot of in the domain. There is a lot of narrative on this. There's a lot of written thoughts, and it may be a little premature to come to conclusions because the war outcomes haven't changed. The outcomes really haven't come through of the war aims. I'll put it across. We know it was a shifting goalpost, and we'll not get into those details. But what has become a challenge for the way Russia used its air power against Ukraine, there's a huge lesson in that itself. But why I'm careful here, because we may end up drawing wrong lessons. Because the way Russia uses its air power is very different from the Western construct of use of air power, and especially so the way we look at air power in India. Russia still has that defensive mentality of the World War II days, where defense of the Rodina or the mainland was the most important thing. So its air power actually was defensive. So the only offensive element was the strategic element of bombers carrying nukes across to project, for deterrence purpose. But from a tactical warfighting purpose on the plains of Europe, I mean, in case of a scenario with NATO, they expected that tactical air power to do the offensive. But that tactical air power offensive was limited to the battle spaces and tied up with the land forces. So there was no really concept which the Russians have in their doctrine or structurally in the organization which actually uses air power offensively the way the West does. There was a change in 1999. There's a change in reorientation post-Russian collapse. But I'm afraid even despite the changes, new platforms, standoff weapons, advanced weapons, which are classically weapons for future air warfare, are still being used in a very conventional manner. So in Ukraine, SEAD, or suppression of enemy air defense, was a campaign which they paid little attention to. In the initial war, they ran a fantastic campaign the first 2 days. The amount of firepower, but they didn't follow it through. They let the Ukrainian air defense survive. And that has turned against them, because now they're using NATO's help with high degree of agility. Now they have prevented the Russian Air Force from overflying their airspaces. Initially, they sent in a lot of helicopters and all that at low levels, which we lost. So the whole air warfare has got constrained by the SAM envelopes. So it's a creation of their own doing. So what it has resulted in, now that you are reliant solely on organic firepower like artillery, rockets and missiles to do depth targeting in Ukraine. The Air Force, which could have supplemented it and bolstered it, is now incapable of doing it because the airspace is not easy to transit safely from offensive point of view. But notwithstanding that, I think Ukraine's Air Force is pretty much faded into non-existence. They're struggling for survival. Russian air power will prevail, but unfortunately in a manner of brute force, rather than precision application and targeting, which in a more sort of cohesive, coalesced manner for the war objectives of Russia. And the last thing I probably just want to add a thought here, that is that a classic example was that the Russian Air Force, the VKS, aerospace forces, a portion of the tactical forces have been hived off and given to the Russian equivalent of their strategic commands. I mean, different Western command structure. So every command of theirs has an element of air power assigned to it. But what is sad, that this is exactly what we are looking at when we talk about jointness, that it has not worked for them.
No, but isn't there a shift from cross pollination? Let's say you take up some resources from one command, give it to the other command which is threatened, which requires that kind of flexibility must be there in the
So
program.
it is not about resources. Russia has brought in, I mean, there are so many air bases which are fighting against, which have been brought into action. They're using adjacent commands as well. But the point I'm trying to make is the construct of having the offensive air power, it has been tied down to the tactical battle and not
Use deeper.
the depth battle, which is what will probably bring out outcomes in the long term of strategic goals of the of Russia. So effectively, what has happened is there's been a huge disconnect between the army, Russian army, its integral air defense, and the tactical air force. So I would think that there are huge lessons for us to learn, especially when we are in this stage where we are restructuring our military.
Okay. Let's go a little further, perhaps related to what you were talking about earlier. Now, we have a legacy of being continental in our
Yes, sir.
planning. We have
Yes,
been having
that's
it right through independence. And there is all this rhetoric which goes on that we will not lose an inch of land, which has actually got not much military significance. That has also made this kind of an attitude perhaps sink in deeper into our psyche. But the fact remains that tomorrow's battle will be a multi-domain warfare. What do you have to say when you look at these elements, how they have shaped us, and tomorrow we're going to face a multi-domain warfare situation? How do we go about it?
So it's a very interesting thing you brought out, because at the end of, I think last 2 decades is the first time I've realized that there is this, that's when I started researching into it, that why is it that we have not been able to get our act together, so to say.
So to say, it comes to that.
But a large thing to it is, if you think about it very seriously, that we fought a whole series of wars very quickly post-independence. And after 1971, that is 50 years plus, we've not fought a major war. And the last serious action we saw was Kargil. Which had, again, very limited construct.
Very limited.
So I would argue, sir, that at some point, in the absence of, what should I say, the fear, I mean, it's a very strange thing to say, that fear or possibility of an imminent war, at some point we have gone our own ways in a peacetime service environment, where each services now become increasingly, gone into its own silos, which in 71 it had broken open. And if anything, we should have come together post 71. We couldn't have come in a more better and opportune moment. But somehow we didn't. I mean, there are a lot of other aspects, higher defense organization, all this, all that. But the fact of it is, don't denying that our threat in India is continental. Our territories, disputed territories, our borders are our worry. The point I'm trying to make here is that while this is not to deny the importance, I'm saying this clearly, that the continental threat is the most pervasive threat. But to look at it merely tactically, the way we see it as a small border issue, is something we need to look at, that maybe our approach in the past may not have been altogether right. So for an example, I'll give an example here. Like the border patrolling, border talks are always with the Indian Army, justifiably. But ever since PLAF started showing its presence in TAR increasingly, air activity slowly increased. Now, if PLAF becomes more stronger, which it is now working very hard in TAR to do, to become a much more capable force in TAR to support the PLA, the border issue can no longer remain restricted to the army, because now there will be air violations. There are fighters patrolling their side of the border. Their ISR aircraft will come to their side of the border. There has to be some air defense reaction. There has to be some response. So it is very important to link the border issues and bring in the other services on board as well, which has happened post Galwan and Doklam, which is I'll say it's a huge encouraging sign to see that I think both the services have at some point managed to realize that they need to put the past aside and move ahead, and necessity has brought them together. Now, whether it is the continental or the maritime domain, you cannot deny that the vertical dimension, and like you said, not lose an inch of land in the northern context, northern borders, makes it that application of force has to be on a very wide front, because we have a huge wide front there, you will need all the help possible.
Definitely.
And since it's not going to be a maneuver, not so much of a warfare of movement out there, cutting off the adversary's supplies, logistics, his reach to the battlefield, which is his strong point today, the logistical capacity which the adversary has across the border compared to us. If you can impact that, it will automatically impact the battlefield. So what I'm trying to say is that we have to look at all aspects of it. ISR, you need space. You have battlefield, our combat architecture, which is there. They are prone to cyber threats. So unless we look at it in a more holistic manner, from a multi-domain approach, what I'm trying to bring out simply that what you alluded to, that we can no longer look at the continental threat as a merely continental threat.
Definitely. Right, we'll go a little further. I know you have much more to offer on that issue, but let's go a little further and let's talk about China a bit. Very interesting for our viewers also whenever you have a program like this and somebody like you joining the program. Things are getting more and more instable. You have a problem there in South China. So it's been there for a long time now. You have a problem in West Asia also creeping up. Now, looking at that, looking at the Chinese in particular, do you think we are somewhere near, or we are at par, or we are ahead of them in terms of parity of force or parity of capabilities in case it comes to it?
China also for a very long time had one of the largest air forces in the world, but it was also of no consequence because the inventory count was so, and it was more of numbers than just sheer quantity. 99 Gulf War is that in the Gulf War period, that's the time they drew lessons from there. And they saw what a difference air power, space made into war fighting. And in fact, it's there in the book by the two colonels when they talk about unlimited warfare. There's a reference to this, that the only apple worth picking from effectively the lessons of this war was the way the air power and space was used. China had a strong, large air force, but not very effective and very little combat experience. Korea was the only bit of combat experience, but thereafter there was nothing. And for a long time, China believed that it was a sort of a deterrence to have a large air force, deter other nations because of the numbers. But over the recent years, numbers are of lesser consequence than what you can do with a platform. China realized that, and I think 99 onwards, if you look at the strategic defense white papers of China, each of them is an amazing read because it gives a very clear, systematic, step-up approach of how they built, reshaped and rebuilt the Air Force. And the US chief had made a statement about 4 or 5 years back, General Mark Walsh, that in another 10 years time, the Chinese Air Force will be larger and more stronger than the US Air Force. Becomes a challenge. Why it becomes a challenge? South China Sea, East China Sea, where the real threat of China lies. Taiwan is the one China, the whole concept revolves around that, and that's his key issue, I'll say, in that area. So his entire focus was on the eastern seaboard, less on TAR. So there was a huge, if you see systematically, PLAF has emerged from air defense of the mainland to now offensive missions. It is doing missions of coercion by flying over Taiwan, saturating the airspace. The numbers of violations have gone up tremendously. They are doing missions deep into the maritime domain. Effectively, the PLAF has managed to, the PLAF and the plan together have managed to push.
Can you just give the full form of PLAF?
The PLA Air Force.
Yeah,
the PLA Air Force, the Chinese Air Force, has managed to push the US dominance of the first island chain in that area.
Exactly.
And they are seeking to freedom up to second island chain. And that's why this Indo-Pacific construct is such a important construct for the US and the West. It sent a long-range bomber with an air-launched cruise missile, the H-6 bomber, on a mission up to Guam and back. It just flew it there on a regular basis and back. Yeah. Guam was the base where the B-52 bombers were based of the US Air Force. Now they have withdrawn that unit to the mainland. So what I'm trying to say is the presence of Chinese
Has helped them.
military presence has been bolstered hugely by the Air Force. They have a very strong navy. They're building aircraft carriers. The idea is, while they have a strong navy, they control the surface, they would now have control over the
Yes,
vertical airspace above. And this A2AD, that anti-area access denial, and the islands which they have constructed, they've created artificial islands with air bases, which can hold up to 150, 200 aircraft. So what has it done, sir? It is pushing the US further and further away, making it more difficult to reach the Chinese mainland. That is anti-area access denial. Similar thing lies in TAR. But TAR was ignored for a long time till Galwan and Doklam happened.
Tibet Autonomous Region.
Tibet Autonomous Region, sir. Still they realized that this area is now, India has come up under strategic priorities. A lot of pressure is there to build up PLF, Air Force resources, Chinese resources in Tibet. It was an ignored area earlier. They used the rocket force to substitute the shortcomings and deficiencies of China's offensive capability of its air power. It is still limited, where we have a huge advantage, the difference-wise. So because of which it compensated it with the rocket force. But now they're rapidly building more and more airfields and all, because in Doklam and Galwan, there's two things they realized, that to keep the Indian threat or keep it managed, they will have to offset the IAF. So for the last 10 years, they've been carrying out these exercises with the Pakistani Air Force, getting experience, exposure in our tactics. They have been operating together. There is also this visit of Zhu Qilang, who was a CMC member and ex-Air Force chief of the PLAF, part of the Chinese Military Commission. And he was there for a long time. And he's an ex-Air Force guy. So he understood air power. Very subtly, they brought in air power in a big way into Chinese military. He visited Pakistan, and I think in 2019 when he met the military leadership there, and probably that is what it is alluded, that they have managed to convince the Pakistani leadership that the PAF could play a role. It's not quoted anywhere, but there are allusions to it. So what does it bring to us? That PAF and PLAF, the Pakistani Air Force and Chinese Air Force, come together, which gives a very potent asymmetry and advantage to offset the advantage which we have now. And why Air Force? There is this plausible deniability. Unlike ground forces, it's like Kargil again. Air power from a depth Air Force, Chinese base, a Pakistani Air Force aircraft is something can operate with impunity, with saying that no, our chaps are not involved. So this is something we need to worry, and in our continental threat, this is as a concern we need to really be concerned about.
Right. A much less change tag, we'll talk about something else. We've always heard of the Air Force, air power. These are the terminologies we have heard. Now today we hear this terminology, aerospace power, much more, and it's being touted everywhere. Now what's the difference really, and what's aerospace power coming down to?
Conceptually, if you go back to Ekman Jashi's writings, when he talked about the continuum, air and space continuum, he says, and that is what it has been world over. It's just sheer fact that you're operating in a vertical domain. Earlier, airspace was up to what we call the Karman line, and above that is near space and outer space. So below the Karman line, this whole volume of airspace governed by the rules of aerodynamics. Above that, rules on astrophysics and space dynamics, aerospace dynamics. So this term got merged because a lot of Air Force applications are today space dependent. Right from our navigation, targeting, imagery, communications, our air defense network structures, ISR, everything is space dependent in a big way. So there has always been this huge element of space in it. Now rest is I will put it simply, probably is a battle of terminology which theorists get into. Aerospace, air and space. space, air. So there are obviously different elements. Like the US Air Force went through this whole period in between where they talked about aerospace and they formed the space forces. A lot of countries today, modern nations, leading power nations, have made air and space force. So if you see recently, there was this whole thing put up to the government to rename it Air and Space Force. So I don't think we should get so stuck on the semantics of it, but understand the fact that today the vertical reaches which move into near and possibly outer space will have to be thought in a holistic continuum package. You cannot look at it separately when it comes to national security and national interests. Space is still ungoverned. There are no regulations, laws as yet, as of now. There are certain agreements and understandings, but everyone is reluctant to ratify any laws because that is a domain of ascendant domain where the way China has progressed there, space is already militarized. There should be no doubt on this. The fact of it is now it is going to increasingly play a role in our national security is what the concern is. So the Air Force, there's a factor in the Air Force because in our service we change our, like in my serving years from the time I joined Air Force and now I started with guns, aircraft with only fighter guns to long-range BVR missiles, which is there today. And I've seen it all in my service career. And with every weapon, your concept of operation changes because your weapon reaches, envelopes have become much more. Concept changes means I have to alter my tactics. I have to retrain my Air Force in tactics to become proficient in it. By the time I get proficient, the next weapon comes along. So it's been work in progress. So similarly, unless we start early from an Indian perspective and bring in space on board, is what the Air Force has done. Very interestingly, from the doctrine and the IF's thinking, they lay no claims of ownership to space, unlike it has happened in some countries. The Air Force firmly believes they are national commons. Everyone has interest in space. Every service, every civil military organization going to have increasingly more interest in space. We are looking at Air Force part of it. Where does it fit in? Like air defense can no longer remain air defense. It has to become aerospace defense because now you will have space being used as a trajectory and as a transient for delivery of weapons as well. So it is a step in a larger conceptual understanding. It is not a turf for a territorial issue. It is a logical growth of a service.
It's inevitable, I guess.
Which is inevitable. And I think it would make sense to embrace it because here we are talking about growing as a nation and not just one service.
And definitely. Right, Marshal, I think we will call it a day there. And thank you so much. And there was a lot more actually to discuss.
Absolutely, I understand.
But then we can't continue with it and, well, our viewers may not like too long a program. But we'll
understand.
Definitely expect you to again come some other time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thank you, viewers. Thanks for tuning in to Bharat Shakti. Do tune in like this now and then, and you will find interesting stories.